Your late night escape into the eerie and strange corners of our past. Welcome to Whispers of History, where the line between history and legend blurs and the past whispers its secrets through the veil of time. Tonight, we journey through moments long past, but no less strange or unsettling. You might not make it through this night, so make yourself comfortable. Remember, history isn't always as dead as we might like to think. But we're in no rush, are we? Go ahead, sit back, breathe deeply, and let the slow pulse of time carry us through the eerie, the unknown, and the slightly unsettling. If you're new here, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your location and local time in the comments. It's always fascinating to know where in the world you're listening from. Now, let's ease into tonight's journey, shall we? The moonlight spills in through the crack of the curtains, casting delicate shadows across the floor. The world outside is hushed, as though it knows that tonight we speak of a different kind of history, the kind that lingers in the corners of the mind long after you've turned the page. You might feel the hairs on the back of your neck lift just slightly, but don't worry. It's just the whispers of time brushing against you, reminding you that nothing is ever truly forgotten. Let me take you to a village in ancient Greece. It's around 400 BC, and the air is thick with the scent of wild herbs and burning incense, the kind that wafts from the altars where the people pray for mercy. You can almost hear the distant murmur of the city, the chatter of merchants and the clinking of coins, but in the corner of the village, something far older looms, something not even the gods can escape. It's the belief that spirits walk among them. And no, not just the spirits of the ancestors who passed into the afterlife. These are the spirits of those who have died by misfortune or with unfinished business. You, like everyone else in this quiet village, understand the threat of these spirits. The curse of dying in dishonor or through an untimely death was well known to the Greeks, and they feared it more than they feared the gods themselves. A peaceful sleep could quickly turn into a nightmare if you happened to share your house with a restless soul. There were rituals, elaborate ceremonies designed to prevent these vengeful ghosts from crossing the threshold. Some say these rituals were simple prayers and offerings. Others claim they involved more unusual practices. Historians still debate whether these rites involved burying the dead with their eyes wide open so they couldn't see their way back. The village had an ancient tradition that many of its dwellings would not be built without a particular stone placed under the doorframe. This stone was not just for structural support, but for spiritual protection. It was believed that this stone could ward off the restless dead who might try to cross into the homes of the living. People slept with their doors locked and windows sealed tight, but the ritual of the protective stone was the real safeguard. The stone, smooth and cold, was an offering to the unseen, a gesture that life in all its form had control over death, or at least over the spirits that lingered after it. But the eerie part, some say that the stones didn't always work. That sometimes it wasn't the house that protected you, but the fact that you yourself were the one who needed to be watched over. After all, death in dishonor was a fate that even the gods feared. As the years passed, this belief in protective rituals spread beyond Greece to Rome and Egypt. The Egyptians, however, were a bit more detailed in their methods. They had learned early on that a dead man's soul could return at any moment, especially if it had been sent to the underworld with unfinished business. It wasn't just an afterthought for them, it was a matter of life and death. Imagine that every time you left your home, you might have to wonder whether a restless soul was watching you from a distance, waiting for its opportunity to return. You wander through the quiet streets of a Roman town now, where the idea of the dead among the living isn't strange at all. In fact, it's expected. Romans didn't simply build their homes with stones for protection, they also built with caution, placing specific objects by their doors. What could these objects be, you ask? Simple. Small figurines of gods placed at doorways to serve as guardians against spirits and curses. These gods weren't always benevolent, but they were necessary. As after all, who else could protect you from the kinds of spirits that weren't content to simply haunt the world of the living? But there's one peculiar custom the Romans practiced that seems almost absurd. They would place a simple lock on the doors of their homes, but not just any lock. This lock, called the spirit lock, had to be made by a blacksmith with a particular kind of iron, a metal said to be unattractive to spirits. No one knows why the metal was thought to repel ghosts, but it became such a well-known practice that even the richest Roman families employed blacksmiths solely for the task. It wasn't just about keeping thieves out, it was about keeping spirits from coming in. And yet, there are always those who question whether these rituals truly worked. Did the stones and the locks keep the ghosts at bay? Or was it simply the fact that the living could fool themselves into thinking they were safe? Was it all superstition, or did ancient people truly understand something we've long forgotten? Historians still argue whether these practices were just ancient paranoia or a deeper connection to forces beyond their comprehension. Remember that odd spirit lock you heard about? Well, it's a reminder that sometimes our ancestors didn't just fear death, they feared the return of what should never return. And perhaps in the quiet hours of the night, they had reason to believe their fears were justified. The wind howls through the ancient streets, carrying with it the faintest scent of incense and something else, something musty, as if the air itself is holding its breath. As you walk through the deserted alley, a sense of unease settles in despite the seeming calm. But you can't quite shake the feeling that the ground beneath you has seen things that are long forgotten by the living. It's easy to forget that the past isn't as distant as it seems, that echoes from ancient times still reverberate in places where history runs deep. Here, in the heart of ancient Rome, death and the supernatural were never quite as distant as one might think. In these very streets, there's a tale of an emperor, though which one is debated, who took the belief in spirits a step further. This emperor, it's said, was terrified of his own mortality. He sought the advice of the greatest minds of his time, all in an effort to delay his inevitable fate. What the emperor found, however, was a strange and eerie practice that would define his reign. It was called the incantation of the double, and it involved creating a perfect copy of oneself, either in a painting or sculpture, so that one's spirit might be preserved in the likeness of their body. The idea was that upon death, the soul would not wander but remain tethered to the likeness, forever guarding the person's memory and ensuring that they would never truly leave. Historians still debate the authenticity of these stories, wondering whether the emperor truly believed that death could be conquered with a painting, or if he was simply a man desperate to cheat time itself. Either way, the practice became oddly common. Noble families began commissioning statues, paintings, or even intricate mosaics of their likenesses, believing that their spirits would live on. These images were placed not only in their homes, but also in public spaces, where they could remain unmolested by time or decay. But here's the eerie part. It's said that some of these paintings and statues, those that were too lifelike, began to stir something far darker. As the years passed, the noble families who had created these double images began to report strange occurrences. It was as though the spirits of the deceased had never really left, lingering in the likenesses of their former selves. The locals would whisper that at night, the statue's eyes appeared to follow them, or that a painted face would change its expression when no one was looking. Some even claimed that on certain nights, these likenesses would exude a faint, cold breath, like a spirit that had slipped from the body and into the image, forever bound to it. This belief didn't die with the emperor. In fact, it became one of the most deeply held superstitions of the time. You could say it was an obsession. People feared that they might be forgotten once they died, and thus their likeness was kept to preserve their essence. But did it really work? Were these images the key to an eternal existence, or just another manifestation of the living trying to outsmart death itself? To this day, the debate continues. Some scholars even suggest that the idea of the double image is a precursor to modern-day practices like embalming and the creation of virtual avatars. But whether or not it was truly effective in preventing restless spirits, well, that's a question that will never be fully answered. In a faraway land, a desert stretches out beneath a blazing sun, with towering sand dunes that seem to reach for the heavens themselves. The air is thick with heat, shimmering over the landscape, blurring the lines between the real and the imagined. Here, the ancient Egyptians left their mark, not just in their grand monuments, but in the eerie rituals they practiced to protect themselves from the unknown. These people understood death as a passage, but they also understood it as a curse, a punishment from the gods for those who had offended them. They were acutely aware that the dead could return, and they took every measure to ensure their safe passage into the afterlife, lest they return to haunt the living. At the heart of Egyptian burial practices was the Book of the Dead, a guide for the soul's journey through the underworld. The book, filled with spells, incantations, and directions, was not just a religious text, but a means of preventing the soul from becoming trapped in the world of the living. It was believed that the soul could wander the earth indefinitely if it was not properly guided. What's more, the Egyptians had a unique way of dealing with ghosts, by keeping them busy. It's a curious custom. Rather than just attempting to lock away the restless dead in their tombs, the Egyptians took it a step further. They buried statues of the deceased at the entrances to their homes, not just to honor the dead, but to act as a form of protection. These statues were believed to be filled with the essence of the deceased, and it was thought that they could ward off any wandering spirits that might try to return. It wasn't just the deceased who were considered at risk, it was the living as well. So these statues served a dual purpose: protection for the living and a reminder to the dead that they were not forgotten. But here, where things get truly eerie, one lesser-known practice involved a special amulet, the Eye of Horus. This amulet, worn by the living, was believed to protect not just from physical harm but from spiritual attack. Some say that the Eye of Horus could even capture the wandering soul of a deceased person, trapping them within the amulet, thus preventing them from returning to haunt the living. How? Historians still aren't sure. But there are records suggesting that the ancient Egyptians had a profound understanding of the metaphysical, something that seems almost ahead of its time. Much like the emperor with his statues, the Egyptians feared the dead for reasons we may never fully understand. Was their belief in the Eye of Horus simply a superstition, or did they know something about the nature of the soul that we have long forgotten? The truth is buried in the sands of time, waiting to be uncovered, or perhaps never to be fully understood. The wandering souls that the Egyptians feared may still be with us, lingering just beyond the veil, waiting for a chance to return. The fire crackles softly in the hearth, its warm glow illuminating the stone walls around you. Outside, the wind stirs the leaves, but inside there is only the stillness of time, time that has witnessed countless stories, many of which have faded into the forgotten corners of history. But some stories never truly die. They linger, waiting for the right moment to be remembered. Tonight, we turn to one of those stories, an ancient tale from medieval Europe, where death was not merely an event but a force that had to be carefully negotiated. In the 14th century, during the Black Death, Europe's streets were haunted not only by the sick and dying but by something more sinister. Death itself was seen as a vengeful presence, stalking through villages and towns, taking lives with an efficiency that terrified even the bravest souls. People believed that if the plague was not properly appeased, it would return again and again. So they took extreme measures not just to protect themselves from the plague, but to keep the spirits of the dead at bay. One of the most unusual practices came from the heart of Italy. In the small town of Bergamo, the people believed that if they buried their dead improperly, without certain rituals, those souls would come back and cause even greater devastation. So what did they do? They didn't just bury the dead in the usual manner. They would bury the bodies face down, believing that this would trap the souls within the grave. The idea was that the soul, seeing itself buried with its face in the earth, would be too disoriented to return to the land of the living. There were even accounts of bodies being buried with large stones placed on their backs, ensuring that they couldn't rise again. Historians still debate whether this practice was truly widespread or if it was simply an isolated superstition. What we do know is that the fear of restless spirits during the Black Death was pervasive. People weren't just afraid of the disease, they were terrified of what would happen if they didn't appease the spirits. Death, in their eyes, wasn't just a biological event. It was a cosmic force that could spiral out of control if not handled carefully. The idea of face-down burial became a symbolic gesture, a way to show the dead that they were not to rise again, not to come back to claim any more lives. The eerie part, some towns believed that the ghosts of those buried face down would visit the living in dreams, warning them of death's approach. Some even claimed to hear the scraping of bones beneath the earth at night, as if the souls were struggling to break free. But in the end, these rituals were designed not to comfort the living, but to keep death itself at bay. And so, the people of Bergamo continued their practices, hoping they'd never need to see the consequences of failure. The full moon rises high above, casting a cold, silvery light over the earth. You walk along a narrow path, the crunch of gravel beneath your feet the only sound. But just ahead, a small chapel appears, its stone walls weathered by centuries of wind and rain. You enter, the air thick with the scent of old wood and incense. Here in the quiet corners of Europe, another superstition takes root, a belief that is still practiced in some parts of the world today, though its origins lie deep in the past. The custom comes from the belief that the dead were never truly gone, especially in rural villages. Even in the 17th century, there were places where people lived in constant fear of the undead. One such place was the remote village of Trun in Switzerland, where stories of the returners had circulated for generations. These returners were said to be the spirits of those who died with unfulfilled desires, or more chillingly, of people who had committed unspeakable acts during their lives. The villagers believed that such souls would rise from their graves to finish what they started, bringing misfortune, sickness, and death in their wake. To prevent these returners from rising, the villagers would perform a strange ritual. They would bury the dead with their bodies twisted in unnatural positions, often with ropes tied tightly around their limbs to prevent them from moving. But the truly unsettling part of this practice was the use of iron stakes. These stakes were driven through the hearts of the deceased, pinning them to the ground so that their spirits could not escape. It was believed that the iron would stop the soul from wandering, trapping it in the grave for eternity. There's one particularly eerie account of a man named Hans who died unexpectedly, and his family, convinced that he had lived a life of sin, decided to take no chances. They tied his body in an odd position, placed the iron stake through his chest, and buried him deep within the earth. But the strange part, days after the burial, locals reported hearing strange noises coming from the graveyard, scratching, low groans, and the unmistakable sound of something moving beneath the soil. Was it the wind? A trick of the mind, or, as some insisted, the restless soul of Hans trying to escape his grave. The scholars still argue whether these practices were an extreme form of superstition or a genuine belief in the power of the dead. The fact remains, however, that the villagers were not content to let their ancestors rest in peace. They feared that if they did not perform these rituals, they themselves would become the next victims of the undead, cursed to live in perpetual fear of the returners. And so, the practices continued, until they were eventually outlawed by the Swiss government in the late 18th century. But even then, the fear of the undead never fully disappeared, and traces of the belief lingered in the rural corners of Europe for centuries to come. In the quiet of the chapel, you can almost hear the whispers of those long gone, still bound to their graves by the rituals of the past. Are these just stories told to scare children, or did people in those times truly believe that death could be so easily undone? Perhaps we'll never know for sure. The night has deepened, the air turning colder as a thick fog begins to settle, wrapping itself around the edges of the landscape. You take a slow, deliberate breath, the chill cutting through your chest like the touch of an unseen hand. As you wander through time, moving from one unsettling story to the next, you arrive at a small village, nestled in the shadows of the mountains. Here, the land has been shaped not just by the earth, but by centuries of superstition, by the fear of the dead and the power they might still hold over the living. In this village, nestled among the dense forests, there was a belief that was particularly chilling. The people here had a very specific way of dealing with those who died under mysterious circumstances. It was believed that if someone died suddenly, especially if they died in a violent or unnatural way, there was a chance their soul would become restless, angry, and unwilling to depart. They feared these spirits would rise, seeking vengeance on those who had wronged them. And so, the villagers developed a practice they called the vampire burial. Yes, long before the legend of Count Dracula took root, there were stories of villagers here who would go to extreme lengths to ensure that the dead remained truly dead. The method was simple but horrifying. They would drive a large iron stake through the heart of the deceased, but it wasn't just any stake. This one was carved with strange runes meant to keep the soul imprisoned. But that was only the beginning. The deceased would be buried face down, with a large stone placed over the body to ensure that no one would disturb the grave. Some reports even suggest that the body was sometimes placed in a casket filled with water to prevent the soul from escaping through the cracks in the earth. The ritual would be performed with great ceremony, with the living standing guard as the body was lowered into the ground. Historians still argue whether this practice was common across the region, or if it was confined to isolated villages like this one. Some believe it was simply an exaggerated superstition, a tale spun by travelers to create a sense of mystery and danger around the remote Transylvanian villages. Others argue that there may have been some truth to these rituals, an unsettling way for the living to ensure that the dead never return to claim what was left of their world. But perhaps the most chilling part of this belief was the understanding that the dead could not simply be locked away in their graves. People whispered that if a body wasn't properly buried, or if the rituals were not followed precisely, the dead would come back. And when they did, they were not the peaceful spirits of ancestors, but something much darker, something far more dangerous. The vampire, the revenant, the restless soul, these were all names used to describe the returners, the ones who could never truly rest. As the moonlight fades and the first light of dawn begins to push the shadows aside, you find yourself in the eerie, cold silence of a small chapel in southern France. Here, nestled in the countryside, an entirely different kind of fear took root in the hearts of the people. This fear was not of the dead, but of what the dead might leave behind, their possessions, their unfinished business, and their anger. The French, like so many other cultures, had their own set of beliefs about death and the afterlife, but here they took it one step further. It was said that a cursed object, something left behind by a restless spirit, could carry that spirit's malice with it, passing from one hand to another like an invisible thread of misfortune. This belief became especially prevalent in the 17th century, when the concept of the haunted relic began to spread. These objects, often personal items belonging to someone who had died a violent or untimely death, were thought to be imbued with the soul of the deceased. Once these objects passed into the hands of the living, it was believed that the spirit would follow them, sometimes causing misfortune, illness, or even death. The items were seen as both a reminder of the deceased and a token of their continued presence in the world of the living. It was believed that if the item was not properly cleansed, the spirit would never be able to move on, forever tethering itself to the object. But here, where the practice becomes more unsettling, people began to take extreme measures to ensure that these objects could never leave the deceased's home. They would seal them away in locked boxes, sometimes in the very tombs where the body lay, hoping to keep the spirit contained. Others went so far as to burn the object, believing that the fire would purify the soul and release it from its earthly tether. But still, the legends persisted. There were whispers of objects that couldn't be destroyed, of trinkets and possessions that survived the flames only to cause harm again. These objects would pass through families, from one generation to the next, as the spirit within them demanded attention. Historians still debate whether these objects were truly cursed or if they were simply the product of superstition and fear. Some claim that the belief in cursed relics was a way to explain away misfortune, an attempt to rationalize things that went wrong in the world. But even today, there are those who swear by the power of these haunted objects, saying they've felt the weight of the curse themselves. So the question remains, did these objects truly carry the souls of the dead, or were they simply a reflection of our fear of what we cannot understand? In this small chapel, surrounded by ancient stone walls, you can almost feel the weight of those long-forgotten objects, locked away, waiting to be passed on. Maybe it's better not to ask too many questions about them. After all, some things are meant to stay buried, forgotten, and undisturbed. The air is thick with mist now, and the world outside seems to have vanished into an ethereal fog, like a place suspended between the past and the present. You find yourself standing before a crumbling tower, its stones worn smooth by the passage of centuries. In this place, the shadows seem to stretch longer, as if time itself is hesitant to move forward. This is a place where old fears were born, where ancient legends still whisper through the cracked windows and fading murals. Here we turn the page to a chapter of history, where the line between the living and the dead was so thin that it could be torn apart with a single step. It's the 16th century in Eastern Europe, and the stories of the undead have begun to take a darker turn. The vampire legends, which we've all heard of, took root in places like Romania and Hungary, but these stories were not just tales to tell around a campfire. They were warnings. The dead, or so people believed, could rise again, and when they did, they weren't the peaceful ghosts of ancestors visiting their homes for one last farewell. These creatures were something far worse. They were creatures of hunger, driven by a desire to drink the life from the living. But there's one case in particular, one story that stands apart from the rest. It's the tale of a man named Peter, whose death in 1725 became the center of one of the most well-known vampire trials in history. The village of in Serbia was already struggling with the aftermath of the Ottoman Empire's influence. There had been conflict, bloodshed, and a general atmosphere of unrest. But when died, the fear that gripped the village went far beyond anything anyone could have imagined. According to the villagers, shortly after his death, people began to die under strange and mysterious circumstances. There were reports of people seeing corpses wandering the village at night, and worse still, people claimed to have seen his body draining the life from others. This story would soon become one of the most famous vampire cases in history, inspiring not only local fears but the global fascination with the undead. Historians still debate whether the villagers' fears were justified or if it was simply a product of a superstitious mind looking for answers to an unexplained epidemic. Was it a case of plague victims spreading disease and dying in the night, or was there something darker at work? No one can say for sure. But the fact that an official trial was held to determine whether Peter had truly become a vampire is proof that, at least in that moment, the fear was real enough to take seriously. His body was exhumed, and when it was opened, it was said that the corpse had not decomposed as expected. The flesh was plump, the nails were long, and the mouth was filled with fresh blood. These are the facts that fuel the vampire lore we know today. But were they true? Did the villagers really see the body of an undead creature? Or were they simply witnessing the natural decomposition of a body in an environment where diseases spread quickly? The eerie part of this story is that the fear of what might happen after death, the fear of souls that refuse to leave, of bodies that might return with a vengeance, was so powerful that it led people to exhuming their loved ones, to scrutinizing the bodies of the dead in a way that seems almost unnatural today. But at the time, it was a necessity. It was not enough to mourn the dead, you had to make sure they stayed dead. The hour is late, and the wind now carries a chill, biting through your cloak as you walk through a sleepy European village. The moon is high, casting long shadows across the cobbled streets. The village is quiet, too quiet, as if it's waiting for something. You come to a halt in front of a small house, its windows dark and still. The door creaks slightly in the breeze, as though it might open at any moment. It's here that we pick up another thread of the strange, dark history that ties death and the supernatural together. A thread that leads us back to the 13th century in England. At this time, people were just beginning to recover from the trauma of the Black Death, but fear still clung to their hearts like a shadow. This fear, however, was not simply of death, but of the things that could happen after death. People were just as terrified of being buried alive as they were of dying in the first place. The reason? During the Black Death, the plague would often cause symptoms that made people appear dead, even though they were still alive. It wasn't uncommon for people to be prematurely buried, and this was a horrific fate for anyone who found themselves in that unfortunate position. The fear of being buried alive became so prevalent that the English began to take extreme precautions to avoid such a fate. One such precaution was the development of what was called the safety coffin. These coffins, designed with a mechanism that would allow the occupant to signal for help if they were still alive, became increasingly popular in England during the 14th century. The most famous of these coffins was a simple design, a bell, a rope, and a small window. The The bell was attached to a rope that went through the lid of the coffin, and if the person inside was still alive, they could ring the bell to alert the living above ground. The small window allowed a last glimpse of the world, just in case the person was still able to move and see. But here's the strange part. Although these safety coffins were created to save lives, there was a widespread belief that the dead would somehow know of these mechanisms and would use them to trick the living. Some believed that the dead would somehow be able to pull on the rope and ring the bell themselves, setting off a chain of panic and fear. Others thought that the bell might even attract other spirits, creating a situation where the living would be caught in a frenzy of supernatural events. No one could say for sure whether the coffins ever worked or whether anyone had ever been saved by the bell. What we do know is that the fear of the dead, alive or not, was enough to cause people to take extreme measures. People weren't just burying their dead, they were trying to protect themselves from the possibility of an undead return. As historians still wonder whether these safety measures were more a reflection of the era's intense fear of death than of any actual danger. Could it be that the dead themselves had no interest in returning, or was it the living who couldn't bear the thought of being forgotten, even in death? The breeze rustles through the trees as you walk deeper into the night, the moonlight now hidden behind a veil of clouds. You feel the weight of the centuries pressing down on you, as if time itself has become a thick, unyielding fog. Ahead of you, a small chapel looms, its silhouette a dark outline against the vast, silent sky. Inside, the air is thick with the dust of centuries past, the scent of ancient wood and candle wax lingering in the air. You step inside, the doors creaking on their hinges, and the chill that greets you makes you feel like you've crossed into another time altogether. This is a place where fear and faith were often intertwined, where the boundaries between the living and the dead seemed impossibly thin. The 17th century in England was a time when belief in witches, spirits, and the supernatural was so pervasive that it shaped the very laws of the land. One of the most unsettling practices during this period was the belief in corpse reanimation, the idea that the dead could return not as ghosts, but as physical beings walking once more among the living. This belief was particularly strong in rural areas, where the knowledge of death was often tied to superstition and fear. The belief in corpse reanimation wasn't just a passing thought, it was an official fear. In fact, it led to some horrifying practices, particularly when someone died under unusual circumstances. One of the most chilling tales comes from the village of in Derbyshire, which was struck by the bubonic plague in 1665. But it wasn't just the plague that people feared, it was the returning dead. Villagers believed that those who died of the plague might rise from their graves and spread the disease even further. As a result, some people were buried with iron spikes driven through their hearts to ensure they couldn't rise again. But more disturbing still were the stories that claimed these measures didn't always work. There were accounts of graves being dug up and the bodies inside found not decomposed, but unnaturally preserved, with the suggestion that the dead might have returned in some form to plague the living once more. Historians still debate whether these practices were truly widespread or the result of exaggerated fear. What we do know is that the villagers were so terrified of the plague and of the possibility of the dead returning that they took extreme measures to prevent it. Some records even suggest that villagers would stay awake through the night, watching over the graves, hoping that their ancestors would remain at rest. But was it superstition, or was there something deeper at work? Could it be that the dead were truly coming back? The fear that the dead might reanimate was not something easily shaken, and it lingered in the minds of many for centuries. The night air is heavy, thick with the scent of pine and earth, as you find yourself wandering through the forests of Norway. Here in the remote wilderness where the stars shine brighter than anywhere else, ancient beliefs still persist, rooted in the soil like the deep roots of the towering trees around you. It's a place where the veil between this world and the next has always been regarded as thin, so thin, in fact, that the living could never be entirely sure who or what might be walking among them. In these forests, stories of the dead returning were not simply idle rumors. The Norwegians believed that the souls of the dead could easily cross into the world of the living if the proper rituals weren't followed. One such ritual, passed down through generations, involved the practice of walking the dead. The belief was that if someone died under mysterious or violent circumstances, their soul might be unwilling to rest and would seek to return to its old haunts. If that person was not properly laid to rest, their soul would wander, looking for unfinished business or vengeance. To prevent this, the Norwegians would take great care in the burial process. Bodies were often buried in special places, such as near running water, to ensure that the soul could not find its way back. But the most chilling aspect of this ritual came from the fear of what would happen if the body wasn't buried properly. If the body wasn't treated with the appropriate reverence, if the soul wasn't properly guided into the afterlife, the dead might return as something more than a ghost. They would become something else entirely, something called they were not the spirits of the dead, but physical beings who had somehow returned from the grave. Their flesh, rotting and decayed, would crawl from the grave, seeking vengeance, and they were said to have the ability to bring sickness and misfortune to anyone unlucky enough to encounter them. The eerie part of this belief is that they were considered more than just stories told to scare children. In certain villages, it was believed that the dead could actually rise from the grave and walk again. Some people even reported encountering these creatures in the forests, describing them as shadows that moved through the trees, their eyes glowing with a strange light. In one particularly unsettling case, a man named claimed to have seen in 1814. He described it as a tall figure with glowing eyes and skin that looked as though it had been peeled back from its bones. According to, they appeared to him one night, walking slowly through the woods, and when it reached him, it spoke in a voice that seemed to come from both inside and outside his mind. Historians still debate whether they were simply folklore, the product of centuries of superstition, or if they were based on real encounters with something that couldn't be explained. Perhaps the fear of the dead returning to life is something embedded in human nature, a fear that runs deep regardless of the culture or time period. Whatever the truth, they became an enduring part of Norwegian folklore, a symbol of the ancient belief that the dead are never truly gone. They only wait for the right moment to return. The moonlight flickers through the trees, casting dancing shadows on the ground as you make your way through a dense, untamed forest. The air is thick with the smell of damp earth and pine, and the silence is broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the soft call of an owl. You feel as though you've stepped into another time, a time where the world was still governed by ancient forces, forces that mankind could never fully understand. Here, in the heart of the forest, there's a legend that has haunted the people of the region for centuries. A legend that ties death to the living in ways that are both mysterious and unsettling. We travel now to Iceland, where in the 19th century, a deeply unsettling practice known as corpse eating was said to have been performed on those who died unexpectedly or unnaturally. It may sound bizarre, even grotesque, but in certain parts of the island, it was believed that consuming the flesh of the dead could prevent the spirit from returning to haunt the living. The reasoning behind this practice was simple. If the body was consumed, there would be nothing left for the spirit to cling to. As it was thought that the soul would become trapped inside the body, unwilling or unable to move on, and would eventually return as a revenant, a type of undead creature with a thirst for vengeance. But how did this practice come to be? Some scholars believe that it was rooted in the fear of a particular kind of death, the death of a person who had died without receiving a proper burial or without having had the chance to make amends for their wrongdoings. According to the people of Iceland, these souls were particularly dangerous as they were seen as being unfinished and prone to returning as vengeful spirits. Consuming the flesh of the deceased was considered the only way to sever the bond between the soul and the body. In some cases, it was said that the body would be dismembered, and pieces of the flesh would be cooked and eaten by the closest family members, who would then perform rituals to ensure that the spirit was prevented from returning. This macabre practice was meant to serve as a kind of ritual purification, ensuring that the deceased could not rise again and harm the living. Historians still debate the extent to which this practice was actually carried out. Some argue that it was more of a superstition, a dark tale spun to explain the many unexplained deaths that occurred in Iceland's remote villages. Others believe that it was a genuine practice, passed down through generations as a way of protecting the living from the wrath of the dead. What we do know, however, is that the fear of the dead returning was so real to the people of Iceland that they would go to extraordinary lengths to ensure that the spirits could never return, even if it meant engaging in the most bizarre and unsettling of rituals. As the wind howls around you, carrying with it the scent of and the distant echo of a whale's call, you find yourself on a rocky coastline, the sea stretching endlessly before you, the waves crashing against the jagged rocks below. Here, in the cold, unforgiving waters of the North Atlantic, the people of Iceland once believed in a particularly eerie form of death-related superstition, the fear of the coffin ship. This legend tells of dead souls whose bodies were sent out to sea in a boat, rather than being buried in the earth. It was thought that if the body was not properly disposed of, it would remain restless, sailing the seas for eternity, carrying its malevolent spirit across the waters. The idea of the was rooted in a particularly terrifying belief that the dead could be more dangerous if they were not properly laid to rest. Unlike many other cultures that sought to keep spirits in the ground, the people of Iceland believed that the sea had the power to trap the souls of the dead in a different way, causing them to wander the oceans for eternity. The practice of sending a dead body out to sea in a boat, known as a coffin ship, was thought to give the spirit a means of escape, but it also served to ensure that the spirit would never return to the land of the living. According to legend, these coffin ships were sometimes constructed in secret, as if the very act of sending the dead to sea was something that needed to be done under cover of darkness. The ship would be loaded with the deceased, accompanied by offerings or sacrifices to appease the spirit. Once the ship was sent out into the vast ocean, it was believed that the spirit would be forever lost, drifting across the water until it could find its final resting place. The eerie part of the legend is the idea that these ships would occasionally return to shore, their sails tattered and the body inside untouched, as if the spirit was still trapped aboard, waiting to claim the living. This led to the belief that the sea, with its deep, unknowable depths, was the perfect place for the restless dead to wander. The sea was not only a physical boundary but a spiritual one, and sending a dead body out to sea was considered the ultimate way to sever any ties between the spirit and the living world. Historians are divided on whether there was ever a widespread practice, or if it was simply a legend born from the isolation and fear of the unknown. Some scholars argue that it was nothing more than folklore, designed to explain the strange occurrences of ships appearing on shore, abandoned with no sign of their crew. Others believe it was a deeply held belief, passed down through generations of seafaring people who feared the restless spirits that might emerge from the deep. Whatever the truth may be, there remains a haunting reminder of the ways in which death, belief, and the unknown were inextricably linked in the minds of the people. The night sky is now shrouded in thick clouds, the moon hidden from view as a heavy silence settles over the land. You walk through a dense, fog-laden forest, the trees casting eerie shadows that seem to stretch and twist with every step you take. The air is cool and damp, and you can almost hear the distant rustling of leaves beneath the weight of something unseen. This place, it feels ancient, as though it has seen more than its fair share of human folly, superstitions, and strange rituals. The land feels heavy with forgotten history, as though the earth itself is remembering something dark. In the heart of medieval Europe, particularly in parts of Germany, there was a deep-seated belief in the idea that the dead could return, specifically that they could return as revenants or wandering spirits that sought to finish their unfinished business. But what makes this particular belief so unsettling isn't just the idea of ghosts, but the specific practices people used to deal with them. In villages that had been ravaged by disease, famine, or war, people were so afraid of the dead returning that they took extreme measures to ensure that they would never rise again. One of the most chilling practices came in the form of corpse handling. If someone died under suspicious circumstances, or if their body was found in a state of unusual preservation, either from disease, an untimely death, or some other tragic event, the family and villagers believed that the person's spirit would return to haunt them. In some cases, the body would be exhumed, and it would be inspected to see if it showed signs of having been alive after death. If the body seemed too well preserved, the family would perform rituals to ensure that the dead person's spirit would never rise. This could involve staking the corpse through the heart, a practice known as vampirism or corpse vampirism, which was believed to keep the soul from reanimating. The eerie part, if the body had any remaining blood or if the mouth appeared to be closed and undisturbed, it was taken as proof that the spirit was still active. This led to some extremely disturbing actions. In certain regions, people believed that the dead could walk as they had in life, and in the case of someone suspected of being a revenant, they would make sure the corpse was kept in check, either by placing stones on top of the body or tying it down so that it couldn't rise. But the ultimate precaution was the idea of decapitation. Decapitation was thought to be the final barrier, ensuring that the dead would remain where they belonged. Historians still debate how widespread these rituals were, and whether they were truly based on belief or were more of a reflection of the times, desperation, disease, and death all coming together to create a nightmare for the living. The gruesome nature of these practices is still shocking today, but it speaks to a profound fear of the dead, that their return could wreak havoc upon the living, and that death could never be truly trusted to take its course without intervention. The forest thins, and you come to a clearing, the sound of running water in the distance, barely audible over the gentle rustling of the trees. The air smells of wet leaves and earth, thick with the moisture of an impending storm. Ahead, you see the flicker of lights in a distant village, but you don't approach it yet. There's a lingering tension in the air, a sense that something darker is at play, something tied to this land, a belief that still grips the people who live here, even though the rest of the world has long forgotten. It is the 18th century, and the small village in rural Scotland is gripped by the fear of the will-o'-the-wisp, an eerie, otherworldly light that appeared at dusk and was said to lead travelers astray deep into bogs and marshes where they would be lost forever. But the will-o'-the-wisp wasn't just a natural phenomenon. It was believed to be the light of the dead, the souls of those who had died but were not properly laid to rest. These souls, it was said, had become trapped in the earth, unable to move on to the afterlife, and their spirits wandered the land seeking to claim the living. The belief was so strong that, in some villages, people would go to extraordinary lengths to ensure that the dead were not allowed to return. One particularly chilling practice involved what was called a corpse light. If someone died unexpectedly, especially if they died under mysterious circumstances, their body would be watched over for several days to ensure that the soul did not rise from the grave. Villagers would light candles around the corpse and keep vigil, fearing that the deceased might return as a will-o'-the-wisp, leading them into dangerous, uncharted territory. The eerie part of this practice: some believed that if the body was left alone for too long, it would begin to glow, emitting a faint light as the spirit inside struggled to break free. If the light appeared, it was a sure sign that the person had unfinished business or had died with a curse hanging over them. The villagers would then take drastic measures to prevent the soul from returning, whether by burning the body or casting it into the marshes to ensure it could never rise again. Historians are still divided on the exact origins of the will-o'-the-wisp legends and the practices associated with them. Some argue that the lights were nothing more than natural phenomena, gases released from decaying organic matter in the bogs, while others suggest that they were tied to ancient fears of death and the restless souls that were thought to wander the earth. What remains clear is that, for centuries, people believed that the dead could be far more dangerous than we tend to think. In places like this, where the line between the living and the dead was so thin, the fear of the return of the dead was a very real and pressing concern. The air is thick with mist as you walk along the deserted road, the moon now a mere sliver of light obscured by drifting clouds. The world feels suspended, caught between reality and something more ethereal, as though the veil between life and death has become so thin that you can almost reach through it. The path ahead leads to a small, ancient chapel, its stones weathered by centuries of wind and rain. Here, in this forgotten place, death is not simply an end. It is something far more intricate, woven deeply into the fabric of the living. The belief that the dead could walk among the living, waiting to return to claim what they were, runs through the bones of this village. We find ourselves in medieval Spain, where a peculiar fear gripped the people of the small mountain town of. In the 15th century, they had a practice that was chilling in its simplicity, a ritual designed to ensure that the dead would not return as revenants. The practice was born from the growing belief that the dead, particularly those who died under mysterious or violent circumstances, could rise again, seeking revenge or simply wandering the earth in confusion. To prevent this, the villagers would perform a ritual known as the burial of the living dead. The ritual began with the body of the deceased being prepared in a manner that would prevent it from returning to the world of the living. The body was often bound tightly in cloth, and in some cases, the face was covered in a way that would make it impossible for the soul to recognize its own body. The coffin, however, was where the real horror lay. The villagers believed that if the deceased was buried in an open coffin, or if the body was improperly sealed, the soul might escape and return. So to prevent this, they would seal the coffin shut with iron bands, ensuring that the dead would remain firmly contained. The most disturbing part of this practice came when a body was suspected of being alive, or more specifically, when the villagers believed that a person had not yet truly passed away. In such cases, the body would be placed in a tomb and a small bell would be attached to the coffin. The bell was a signal meant to alert the living in case the person suddenly awoke. The dead, it seemed, were never truly at rest. This safety bell was thought to be an assurance, allowing the living to check on the deceased if they feared the body had been buried too soon. But what if the bell rang? The thought was enough to send chills down the spine. Historians are still divided about the prevalence of these practices. Some believe that they were confined to superstitious villages, isolated from the rest of Spain, where the fear of the dead returning was greater than the desire to respect the deceased. Others argue that these rituals were part of a wider cultural phenomenon, where the living believed that death was not a simple passage, but a complex, terrifying event fraught with the potential for the spirit to break free from its earthly bonds. Was the burial of the living dead a precautionary superstition, or did it reflect a real fear that death could be avoided or cheated? The answer is as elusive as the spirits these practices were meant to trap. The wind howls through the trees as the dark, oppressive clouds gather overhead. You feel the temperature drop suddenly, the chill creeping into your bones as the atmosphere grows heavier. The village ahead is a strange one. Old, weathered buildings line narrow, winding streets, and there is an unsettling quiet that hangs in the air as though the world is holding its breath. In this place, the people have lived with death and with the fear of what comes after for centuries. The fear of spirits that refuse to leave, of souls trapped between worlds, has shaped every corner of life here. We find ourselves in a small town in Hungary during the 18th century, where a belief took root that would persist long after the age of superstition had supposedly passed. The fear of the returning dead was particularly strong here, not just because of the high mortality rates brought on by war and disease, but because the people believed that the dead could come back with a vengeance. This belief was closely tied to the idea of the vampire, a creature that rose from the grave to feed on the living and to spread disease and chaos. They were believed to be the souls of the dead who had not been properly laid to rest, their spirits bound to the earth by unfinished business or violent deaths. The practice of ensuring the dead stayed dead became so pervasive that it became a ritual that was performed with great care. The strangest part of this practice, however, came when a person was suspected of becoming if someone had died unexpectedly or violently, and their body showed signs of unusual preservation or bloating, the villagers would become suspicious. They feared that the body might be and to prevent it from rising, they would perform a gruesome ritual. First, the body would be exhumed and the deceased's mouth would be opened. If the body was found to have blood in its mouth, it was considered proof that the person had returned from the grave and was now a vampire. To stop this, the villagers would drive a stake through the heart, decapitate the body, and sometimes burn the remains to ensure the soul could never rise again. The eerie part of this practice lies not just in the physical ritual, but in the belief that the dead could truly return. The act of decapitation and burning was not only seen as a necessary step to prevent the return of the dead, it was also a symbolic gesture, one that demonstrated the village's complete fear of the dead's power. Even after death, the body was still a threat to the living, and the only way to protect the village was to ensure that the soul was trapped in the grave forever. Historians debate the extent to which these vampire rituals were practiced. or whether they were simply exaggerated stories passed down through the years. Some claim that these practices were part of a collective anxiety in response to plagues, wars, and famine, where any unexplained death was seen as a potential return of the dead. Whatever the truth may be, the legacy of the practices meant to prevent their return linger in the folklore and superstitions of the region, reminding us that, for some, death was never truly an end. It was simply a pause, a moment of waiting to see if the dead would rise again. The night has deepened further, and the wind now carries the chill of impending rain. The trees around you sway in the darkened forest, their shadows stretching unnaturally across the ground. You walk along the path, your steps muffled by the soft earth beneath you, feeling as though you are moving through a place that exists just beyond the edge of reality. There is a sense that this land holds secrets dark and forgotten that might never be fully uncovered. And yet, history, with all its eerie truths, persists. In the heart of 18th century Poland, there was a peculiar fear that gripped the small villages scattered across the countryside. The fear was not just of the dead, but of the wicked dead, those who, it was believed, had returned from the afterlife with a thirst for vengeance. These were the revenants of Polish folklore ghosts, but more than that. They were seen as souls who had been cursed to return, twisted and tormented, their bodies in a state of partial decomposition, driven only by the need to cause harm to the living. And to prevent these terrifying spirits from rising, the people of Poland practiced an ancient, macabre form of prevention known as the declaration of the dead. If someone was suspected of being in, the villagers would gather to ensure that the person was properly laid to rest. This often meant more than simply burying the deceased. It involved rituals to seal the spirit in the grave. One of the most chilling practices was the use of iron spikes or nails, driven into the heart of the body, ensuring that no spirit could escape. This was believed to be the only way to trap the soul inside the body, preventing it from rising and wreaking havoc. However, there was another strange aspect to this practice. In some cases, the villagers would exhume the bodies of the deceased after a certain period of time to check for signs of the dead's return. If the body was found to be unusually preserved, or if there were any signs of movement or bloating, the villagers would take immediate action. In some cases, the body would be dismembered, with the limbs or head removed, and the pieces scattered to prevent the body from being reanimated. The idea was to completely sever the connection between the body and the soul, ensuring that the dead could never return to claim the living. The most unsettling part of this belief was the idea that the dead could return, not as passive ghosts, but as physical beings, who could walk the earth and infect the living with their curse. The terror that these spirits instilled was so great that entire communities would go to extreme lengths to ensure their safety. But did these practices work? Were the dead truly capable of returning in this horrific form? Historians are still unsure, but what's clear is that, for the people of Poland, the line between the living and the dead was always blurry. The fear of the dead's return was never fully laid to rest. The darkness grows deeper still, and the weight of the night feels heavier. You walk further into the unknown, the sound of your footsteps muted by the thick mist that now clings to the earth like a shroud. The world around you feels as though it is caught between the past and the present, each step forward taking you further into a place where the boundaries of time begin to blur. In this place, the dead have not only left their mark, they have shaped the very landscape of belief. We find ourselves in 19th century Russia, where the belief in the return of the dead was deeply ingrained in the culture. Here in the dark, freezing winters, The fear of spirits rising was compounded by the harsh realities of life and death in a land where disease and famine were constant threats. But it wasn't just the fear of ghosts that haunted the people of Russia. It was the fear of a terrifying, bloodthirsty creature that rose from the grave to feast on the living. The most famous case of the comes from the early 1800s in a village near the mountains. The village had been struck by a mysterious illness, and as more and more people fell ill and died, rumors began to spread that one of the recently deceased might not have died at all. In the dead of winter, the villagers gathered to the body of the suspected vampire, a man who had died just days before. When they opened the grave, they found that the body was unusually preserved, so much so that it appeared to have been recently alive. His skin was firm, his hair still intact, and most disturbingly, there was fresh blood around his mouth. Fearing that the man had returned the villagers quickly set to work. They drove a large wooden stake through his heart, decapitated him, and burned the body, believing that these measures would ensure the soul was trapped in the grave, never to return. But the terror didn't stop there. It was said that the death toll in the village continued to rise, even after this body was destroyed. The villagers were gripped by a deep existential dread that death itself might be a doorway, and that, for some souls, it was never truly the end. Historians are still divided over whether these vampire legends were merely the product of superstition, born from the fear of disease and unexplained deaths, or if they were based on something more tangible. Some suggest that the phenomenon of vampirism could have been a result of certain diseases, such as tuberculosis, which caused symptoms that could be misinterpreted as signs of the undead. Others believe that the legend was simply a reflection of the deep anxiety surrounding death and the afterlife in a land plagued by hardship. But one thing is certain. The belief in the dead returning in such a terrifying form became an enduring part of Russian folklore, cementing thee as one of the most enduring figures in global mythology. Whether these creatures were real or merely the stuff of nightmares, their legacy continues to haunt the pages of history, a chilling reminder of humanity's deep fear of what lies beyond death. The wind picks up, carrying with it the sharp scent of pine and the promise of more rain. As you walk, the world around you becomes even darker, the forest dense and oppressive. You feel as though you're walking in the footsteps of history, where the shadows of the past still linger like forgotten memories. The path ahead winds through thick undergrowth, the crunch of twigs beneath your feet the only sound. It feels as though the earth itself is holding its breath, waiting for something to emerge from the mist. In this eerie setting, we turn to the remote highlands of Scotland in the early 19th century, where the fear of the dead was intimately tied to a peculiar and unsettling belief. The people here, living in harsh, isolated conditions, were deeply superstitious. They believed that the dead, especially those who had died suddenly or violently, were more likely to return as something other than a ghost. They were not merely spirits. They were entities that had become trapped in the world of the living, neither fully dead nor fully alive. The belief in the walking dead was particularly strong in the Highlands, where the practice of corpse roads developed. These roads were specific paths that the deceased were believed to follow as they made their journey to the afterlife. However, the practice surrounding these roads was anything but peaceful. The dead, it was thought, could wander off the road if they weren't properly guided, becoming restless spirits that would return to the land of the living, wreaking havoc on anyone they encountered. The fear of these wandering spirits was so great that special rituals were performed to ensure that the body would stay on the right path, on its journey to the afterlife. The most chilling of these practices involved the placement of the deceased. Before burial, the body would be laid out in the home with a special ritual that involved the placement of certain objects, items that would supposedly anchor the spirit to the body, preventing it from rising and wandering. In some cases, the body would be weighted down with stones, and a large knife would be placed at the feet to ensure the spirit could not escape. But the most terrifying part of the practice came when a person was suspected of becoming one of the walking dead. If a body was exhumed and found to have signs of life, such as blood in the mouth or an unusually preserved corpse, the body would be treated with terrifying brutality. In some instances, the body would be decapitated, burned, and then scattered to prevent it from ever rising again. Historians still argue whether these practices were widely known or if they were simply an exaggeration of the fearful minds of rural villagers. What we do know, however, is that these rituals reflect a deep fear that death was never a final event. For the people of the Scottish Highlands, the journey from life to death was fraught with danger, and the return of the dead was something they were desperate to prevent at all costs. The storm has begun and the rain comes down in sheets, the sound of it striking the earth like 1,000 whispers. You find shelter under the canopy of a towering oak tree, the wet leaves glistening in the dim light. The world around you feels timeless, suspended in a moment where history and myth blend seamlessly together. It's here, in the deep forests of northern Europe, that we turn our attention to a particularly unsettling belief that has haunted the people of the region for centuries: the belief in the Viking revenant. In the ancient Norse tradition, death was not just an end, but a passage to another world. However, the Norse people also believed that not all who died made it to Valhalla, or some souls, it was feared, became trapped between worlds, neither alive nor fully dead. These souls were known as a kind of revenant that rose from the grave to walk among the living, driven by a hunger for revenge or, in some cases, to protect their family or clan. Unlike the spirits of ancestors who might watch over their descendants, there was a malevolent force, intent on causing harm. The most unsettling aspect of the legends is that these revenants were not just spirits. They were physical beings. They were said to have the ability to leave their graves at night and wander the land, causing havoc wherever they went. They could be as large as a man or as monstrous as an animal, with flesh that had rotted away, leaving behind only the terrifying semblance of life. This return was often linked to unfinished business, or the desire for vengeance against those who had wronged them in life. And to prevent the return of the Norse people developed a series of gruesome rituals. These included the practice of staking the body in the grave, sometimes with a large wooden stake driven through the heart, to ensure that they could never rise again. In some cases, the body was weighed down with stones to keep it firmly in place. There were even stories of entire villages gathering to perform rituals that would seal the tombs of those suspected of becoming, to ensure that they would not rise from their graves to seek vengeance. The eerie part of this belief lies in the fact that the Norse did not just fear the dead, they feared the living dead. They were not seen as mere ghosts or spirits, they were physical beings with the power to inflict real harm on the living. This belief in them became so pervasive that it shaped many of the burial practices and superstitions of the Norse people. But the question remains: were these creatures merely a reflection of a culture's fear of the unknown, or was there something deeper at work? Could there have been a manifestation of the very real fears that plagued the Norse people? The fear of an untimely or violent death. The fear of being buried with unfinished business. Historians still debate whether these were purely mythical or if they were based on real historical occurrences. Some argue that the stories of were exaggerated accounts of real events, perhaps instances where people had been buried prematurely or where unexplained deaths were misinterpreted as revenants. Whatever the truth may be, that continues to haunt the folklore of Northern Europe, a chilling reminder that for some cultures, death was never the final barrier it is often believed to be. The storm rages on, the wind whipping the rain in every direction as you trudge through the damp, muddy forest. The trees sway violently above you, their branches creaking under the strain. There's an almost palpable tension in the air, a sense that you're walking in a place where time and nature have combined to hide something long forgotten. The distant rumble of thunder only adds to the atmosphere of unease. You walk deeper into the night, the shadows stretching as though trying to swallow you whole, but there's no turning back now. The past is waiting to reveal another eerie chapter. In the remote villages of the Balkans, an ancient belief flourished, a belief tied to death and the supernatural, rooted in the region's complex history and the constant struggle between faiths. By the 18th century, the belief in vampires had become so ingrained in local culture that it was woven into the fabric of everyday life. The undead revenants were believed to be the souls of the dead who had risen, returning to torment the living. But what made this belief even more unsettling wasn't just the idea of the vampire, but the extreme measures taken to ensure that the dead stayed buried. They were not simply feared for their bloodlust. They were feared because they could cause disease, misfortune, and death. According to popular belief that had a specific set of characteristics, they were undead, often bloated with blood, and had an insatiable hunger for the living. If someone died under suspicious circumstances, suddenly, violently, or with no clear explanation, it was believed that they might return as a. These people were not just buried like any other dead. In fact, the fear was so great that special precautions were taken to ensure that the would not rise. One of the most chilling practices was the exhumation of bodies suspected of being. The villagers would dig up the body, often months after burial, to see if there were any signs that the person had returned from the grave. If the body was found to be unusually preserved, bloated, or with blood still in its mouth, it was seen as confirmation that the deceased had become a vampire. In such cases, the villagers would perform an immediate and gruesome ritual to ensure that the would never rise again. The most common method was to drive a large wooden stake through the heart of the body, ensuring that the spirit would be trapped in the grave. Some accounts even describe the removal of the head, which was placed between the legs, and the body being burned to ensure that the vampire's soul could not escape. The eerie part of this belief is not just the practice of exhuming bodies, but the deep fear it reveals. It wasn't simply about dealing with death. It was about the living trying to assert control over something they couldn't fully understand. Were these actions simply a way to explain illness and death that had no rational cause? Or was there something more to these rituals, something that stemmed from the very real fear of the dead coming back for the living? Historians are still debating whether these rituals were based on real occurrences, or if they were simply the product of superstition and fear. What we do know, however, is that the belief in them was so strong that entire communities would gather to ensure that their loved ones stayed dead, no matter the cost. The storm is at its peak now, the thunder shaking the ground beneath your feet as the rain pelts down in sheets. You move through the mist, the world around you reduced to shadows and whispers. It feels as if time itself has stopped, as though you've been transported to a place where history is still unfolding. Ahead of you lies a quiet village nestled in the hills, where another dark chapter of history awaits. We now turn our attention to a lesser-known but equally eerie belief in the land of old Czechoslovakia. In the late 16th and early 17th centuries, the belief in vampires began to intertwine with an even darker superstition, the fear of necromancy. The practice of necromancy, attempting to raise the dead and communicate with spirits, was widespread across Europe during this time. But in Czechoslovakia, it took on a particularly sinister form. People believed that the dead could be forced to rise from the grave, not just by dark rituals, but by necromancers who used the bodies of the deceased for their own purposes. These necromancers were said to be able to control the dead, making them rise and walk as if they were alive. But here, where it gets truly chilling, the belief in necromancy was so strong that entire villages began to take extreme measures to prevent the dead from being used in these dark rituals. The practice of burying the dead alive became a horrifying reality in some areas. The idea was that if someone was believed to be a necromancer, they would be buried in a manner that would prevent their body from being raised again. The body would be buried face down, or sometimes even nailed into the coffin, in an effort to prevent the spirit from returning to life. In the most extreme cases, necromancers were buried with a stake driven through their heart, their hands bound tightly to prevent them from performing any dark rituals. But the fear didn't end there. In some parts of Czechoslovakia, it was believed that the dead could be made to speak from the grave, to answer questions posed by the living. This was the practice of the talking dead, where villagers would gather around the grave of someone who had recently died, hoping to receive answers from the deceased. These, while not universally practiced, were a frightening reminder of the power that the dead were believed to hold. If the deceased spoke, it was said, they could reveal secrets from beyond the grave, secrets that could shift the balance of life and death. The eerie part of this belief is not just the practice of raising the dead or speaking to them, but the fear it reflects. The fear that death is not the final end, that it's only a transition to something more uncertain. Historians are still uncertain about how widespread these practices were and whether they were more than just local legends. Some argue that the fear of necromancy was a reflection of the social and political unrest of the time, where people sought explanations for the inexplicable. But what's clear is that for the people of Czechoslovakia, the dead were never far from the living. Whether through the belief in necromancy, the fear of or the terror of the talking dead, the dead had a power over the living that was not easily dismissed. The storm has finally passed, but the air remains thick, humid, as though the world is holding its breath. The forest is quieter now, the leaves glistening in the afterglow of the storm. You walk carefully, the path ahead clear but still fraught with a sense of unease, as though something or someone is watching. As you move deeper into the shadow of the ancient trees, you realize that the air feels heavier than before, a weight perhaps from the stories buried in the past. In the 18th century, there was a chilling belief that ran deep through parts of Eastern Europe, particularly in the rural regions of Romania and Bulgaria. This belief was rooted in the fear of the unquiet dead, spirits that were not simply lingering as ghosts, but whose souls were believed to have become trapped in the earthly realm, neither fully alive nor fully dead. These spirits were thought to be capable of possessing the living, spreading illness, and causing harm to anyone unfortunate enough to cross their path. But the true horror came from the belief that these spirits could be summoned back from the grave, an act that was not only forbidden, but also deadly. The practice of raising the dead, or more specifically, attempting to communicate with the dead, was regarded as one of the most dangerous acts anyone could undertake. In villages where fear of the undead ran deep, There was a belief that certain objects or rituals could call the dead back to life. These necromantic practices were strictly forbidden, and anyone caught attempting such acts was considered a threat to the very balance of life and death. One of the most unsettling aspects of this belief was that those who attempted to raise the dead were believed to invite the wrath of the spirits they tried to summon. It was thought that these spirits, once disturbed, would not only rise to reclaim the lives of the living, but would also bring destruction to the village, spreading disease, misfortune, and even death. The rituals to ensure that the dead remained undisturbed were extreme. In many cases, when a person died under mysterious circumstances, they would be buried with a stake driven through their heart, or they would be placed face down in the grave to ensure they could not rise. Villagers would even place heavy stones on the coffin to keep the dead firmly in place. But perhaps the most eerie precaution was the belief that the dead had the power to enter the living, to possess their bodies and turn them into instruments of terror. If a person was suspected of being possessed, the community would take steps to ensure that the spirit was exorcised or destroyed. This could involve burning the body, staking it through the heart, or even decapitating it. Historians still argue whether these practices were widespread or isolated to particular regions. Some suggest they were simply folklore, a product of the fear and superstition that pervaded rural Eastern Europe. Others believe that these beliefs were more deeply ingrained, tied to a cultural understanding of death and the afterlife that was far more complex than we can imagine. The terrifying part, however, is that for the people of these villages, the fear of the unquiet dead was not a myth. It was a reality they lived with every day. The clouds have finally parted, and a cool breeze rustles through the trees as you continue on your path. The night is quieter now, the silence broken only by the occasional croak of a distant frog or the gentle whisper of the wind through the leaves. You feel the weight of history upon you, so many lives, so many stories, some of them long forgotten, others still lingering in the corners of the world. Ahead of you, a small village comes into view, its silhouette dark against the fading light of the sky. It is here that another chapter of this unsettling history unfolds. We now find ourselves in the remote countryside of Hungary in the early 18th century, where the fear of the undead was at its most intense. The people here were no strangers to hardship, war, plague, and famine were constant companions. But it wasn't just these earthly terrors that haunted them. It was the belief in the malevolent spirit that rose from the grave to feed on the blood of the living. The belief in the was deeply rooted in the fear of disease and death, especially during times when plagues would ravage entire communities. The disease itself was often misinterpreted as the work of the undead, and the idea that it could spread sickness and death through its bite became a terrifying certainty. But that was not simply a myth. To the people of Hungary, the vampire was a very real threat, and they took extreme measures to ensure that the undead would not rise from their graves. One of the most disturbing practices involved the exhumation of bodies, particularly in cases where a person had died from an unknown illness or under mysterious circumstances. When a person died in this manner, their body was often dug up to check for signs that they had become a. If the body was found to be unusually preserved, with blood still in the mouth or the skin appearing fresh, it was seen as evidence that the person had risen from the grave. In these cases, the was destroyed, its body impaled with a wooden stake, decapitated, or burned. These measures were taken to ensure that the spirit could not return to spread death and disease. The eerie part of this practice, however, was that it was not just the body that was feared. that was believed to have the power to possess the living, to infect them with its disease, and to turn them into agents of death. As a result, entire families were sometimes destroyed in the process of rooting out the undead. The community would come together to destroy but in doing so, they would often exorcise the living as well, fearing that the taint of the undead could spread. Historians still argue whether these rituals were a result of superstition or whether they were a desperate attempt to combat the real, tangible fears that plagued these communities. Some believe that the fear of the was simply a reflection of the way the people tried to make sense of death and disease, especially during times of overwhelming tragedy. Others argue that the fear was born from something more primal, the fear that the dead were never truly gone, and that their return was not just a possibility but a certainty. Whatever the truth may be, the story of thee and its terrifying power remains a haunting reminder that death, in all its forms, is never as final as we wish it to be. The night has taken on an almost surreal quality, as the moonlight breaks through the canopy above, casting sharp, ghostly shadows across the path ahead. The air is cool and damp, and the forest is eerily still, as though it too is waiting for something to emerge from the darkness. With each step, you feel as though you're walking through a place where the past and the present are indistinguishable, a place where history lingers, refusing to be forgotten. In the 17th century, the rural villages of Scandinavia, particularly in Norway, were deeply entrenched in the belief that death was far from final. In fact, the idea of the returning dead, those who could rise from their graves and cause havoc, was a terrifying reality for these people. But unlike the widely known vampire legends, these revenants had a different, more chilling nature. The Norse believed in a type of undead being known as the creatures that could rise from the grave and walk among the living. They were not simply the spirits of the dead, but physical entities that had returned to the world of the living, often in a grotesque and terrifying form. These beings were said to have the ability to control the weather, summon storms, and bring misfortune to those who crossed their path. Their bodies were often bloated, decayed, and sometimes exhumed with an unmistakable stench of death. Some stories even tell of the growing larger and more powerful as they fed on the life force of the living. What makes this belief so terrifying is not just the idea of but the measures taken by the living to prevent them from rising. In some areas of Norway, when a person died under mysterious or suspicious circumstances, the body would be treated with extreme care to ensure it would not return. The deceased would be buried face down to prevent them from finding their way out of the grave. In some cases, their bodies would be placed in a stone tomb, which was then sealed with heavy stones to keep them trapped inside. Even more chilling, some believed that they could only be stopped by decapitation, and the head would often be placed between the legs of the body to ensure the spirit could never rise again. The eerie part of this practice is that the fear of was not limited to the belief that they could harm the living. It was the idea that death itself was a doorway that could never be securely locked. They represented the fear that the dead could return not just as ghosts or spirits, but as malevolent forces, roaming the world with a hunger for vengeance. Historians still debate whether the belief in was a way to cope with the high mortality rates of the time, especially from disease, or whether it was a genuine fear of the supernatural. Regardless, it is clear that for the people of Scandinavia, they embodied the terrifying possibility that death was not an end, but merely a transition to something much worse. The moon is now a pale, haunting light above you, its soft glow casting a silvery haze over the landscape. You feel as though you are walking through a forgotten chapter of history, where the boundary between the living and the dead is a thin, fragile thread. The air is cool, and every step feels like a journey deeper into a place where the past is never truly buried, but rather lingers like an uninvited guest. As we shift to the early 18th century, we arrive in the isolated, fog-covered islands of the islands, located between Iceland and Norway. These islands, with their rough, unforgiving landscapes, were home to a belief that death was not a singular event, but part of an ongoing struggle between the living and the dead. The people of the islands believed that certain souls, particularly those who had died a violent or untimely death, could return as vampires, but these creatures were different from the more commonly known versions of the undead. These vampires were not just blood drinkers. They were powerful, malicious beings that could take control of the living. The legend of the, or nightmare vampire, was particularly pervasive in these islands. Unlike other vampire legends, there was believed to be a spirit that could physically enter a living person's body, often while they slept, and then drain their life force. There was thought to be a spirit that clung to the deceased's body, refusing to move on after death. It was said to have the ability to invade the dreams of the living, causing them to wake up feeling exhausted, terrified, and sometimes paralyzed by the sense of being smothered. The people of the islands, terrified of the, developed several ways to prevent the undead from attacking. The most common practice was to place a knife or sharp object under the pillow of a person believed to be at risk of being haunted by a. The idea was that the sharp object would drive away the spirit or cause it to lose its power. In some cases, the deceased would be buried with specific objects, such as stones or iron, to prevent their spirit from leaving the grave and attacking the living. But perhaps the most unsettling belief was that they could enter the body of a living person and over time turn them into a vampire themselves. This belief led to widespread fear and suspicion, as entire villages would sometimes believe that it had entered their community and would hunt down those believed to be possessed, performing exorcisms or extreme rituals to rid them of the spirit. The eerie part of the legend is not just the idea of a vampire that feeds on life force, but the notion that the dead could reach out to possess the living. The fear that death was not an end, but a continuation of suffering, left an indelible mark on the people of the islands. It's a belief that still echoes in some of the island's most remote areas, where the fear of the undead is not just about what lies beneath the earth, but about the very possibility that death can never truly separate us from those we lose. Historians still debate the origins of the legend, with some suggesting it was a fear of sleep paralysis, where the sensation of being unable to move or breathe could be mistaken for supernatural possession. But whether it was a real belief or simply a way to explain the unknown, there remains one of the most chilling tales of the undead from this isolated part of the world. The night has deepened, and the forest is alive with the sounds of distant creatures. The moon, now a pale crescent in the sky, casts a soft, ethereal glow on the path ahead. The air is thick with the smell of damp earth and the faintest trace of flowers that have bloomed in the shadow of this ancient land. As you continue your journey, you feel as though you're walking on the precipice between two worlds, the living world you know and the world of the forgotten and the lost, where dark histories unfold with each step you take. In the late 19th century, a chilling belief took root in the remote villages of Bulgaria, particularly in the mountainous regions. The belief in the, or vampire, was already deeply ingrained in the culture, but the fear of the unquiet dead, those who had died under mysterious or violent circumstances, was even stronger. These people believed that the dead could not only rise from their graves, but could also spread disease, misfortune, and death to the living. But the terrifying part of the legend was not just that the dead could return. It was that they could become powerful agents of destruction, capable of controlling the living and even creating new vampires to do their bidding. There was thought to be more than just a bloodthirsty creature. It was believed that these vampires could be summoned through dark rituals and that they had the power to control the bodies of the living, draining their life force and turning them into mindless thralls. There was also associated with a belief in soul transference, the idea that the soul of the dead could pass into the living and possess them. This led to widespread fear that anyone who had come into contact with and could themselves become a vampire, spreading the curse further. One particularly eerie practice involved the exhumation of bodies suspected of being. If a person had died unexpectedly or violently, their body would be dug up to check for signs that they had become a vampire. If the body was found to be unusually preserved or bloated, it was considered proof that the deceased had returned from the grave. The villagers would then take drastic action to prevent them from rising again. This could involve staking the body, decapitating it, and sometimes even burning the remains. In some cases, they would be buried with stones or iron objects placed on top of the grave to prevent the spirit from escaping. Some legends even suggest that certain were so powerful that they could leave their graves and walk the earth, seeking to convert the living into new vampires. The most unsettling part of the myth is the fear that the dead were not simply trapped in their graves, but could rise again as powerful, malevolent beings, capable of manipulating the living and creating new vampires at will. The villagers believed that if they didn't take these extreme measures, they would continue to spread death and destruction, leaving no one safe. Whether these practices were based on real encounters with disease or the fear of death and disease is still debated by historians. But one thing is certain: the fear of the undead and the lengths people would go to prevent their return is a chilling reminder of how deeply death and the unknown can shape the lives of those who live in constant fear. The air has grown still, the weight of the night pressing down on you as you walk deeper into the woods. The trees around you stand like silent sentinels, their branches twisting and reaching out in strange, jagged patterns. The quiet is unnerving, as though the forest is waiting for something to happen. You sense that the stories of old are not yet finished, that the tales of the undead, the returners, and the restless souls still have one more dark chapter to reveal. As we move further into the 17th century, we arrive in the remote villages of Eastern Europe, where the belief in the undead who rise from their graves with no will of their own was beginning to take hold. But this version of the undead was different from the legends that had already taken root in the region. There was not a creature driven by hunger or vengeance, but one whose soul had been taken by dark magic. These souls, trapped between life and death, were said to be under the control of a sorcerer or necromancer, who could raise the body from the grave and command it to do their bidding. In these communities, it was believed that the dead could not simply return to life without help. If someone died and was later suspected of having unfinished business, or if their death was seen as unnatural or violent, they could be raised by a necromancer. The body would be exhumed, and if it was found to be unusually preserved, the villagers would take action to prevent them from wandering the earth. The necromancer was thought to use rituals to bind them to their will, forcing the body to rise from the grave and carry out tasks for the sorcerer. In some cases, it was said that they could be used as a weapon, a tool of terror to strike down those who opposed the necromancer's will. The most disturbing part of the myth is the idea that the dead could be enslaved, not by their own will, but by dark forces that sought to control them. In these villages, it was believed that they had no memory of their former lives, no agency of their own, and were little more than puppets for their masters. They were the walking dead, but not the vengeful spirits of vampires, or they were the soulless, empty shells of humanity, slaves to the dark magic that had bound them to the earth. Historians still argue whether these tales were based on real occurrences or were merely the product of superstition. Some suggest that the fear of the was tied to the high mortality rates and mysterious deaths that plagued rural communities during this time. Others argue that the belief in reflects the fear of losing control, not just over the body, but over the very essence of what it means to be alive. Whether real or imagined, the fear of the remains one of the most chilling aspects of Eastern European folklore, a reminder of how deeply the fear of death and the unknown can shape a culture's beliefs. The air is crisp now, the coolness of the night wrapping around you like a heavy cloak. The moon casts long shadows across the landscape, the silver light reflecting off the wet ground, making the world seem both familiar and otherworldly. As you continue your journey, the path ahead twists and turns, as though it's guiding you deeper into the heart of something ancient, something that refuses to fade into the past. We now find ourselves in 18th century France in the heart of the countryside, where the fear of the dead returning was intimately connected to the powerful role that superstition and religion played in the daily lives of the people. The French, despite their advancements in philosophy and the arts, were still deeply entrenched in the belief that death was a gateway, a door that could either lead to eternal rest or to a dark, twisted form of resurrection. In particular, the people in rural regions feared the revenant, a spirit of the dead that could come back in a physical form, seeking to punish the living for wrongdoings, or simply to avenge an untimely or unnatural death. The revenant was not like the of Eastern Europe, who rose from the grave to drink the blood of the living. The revenant was more insidious. These spirits were believed to be the bodies of the deceased that had not been properly laid to rest, whose souls were restless and filled with anger. They did not merely haunt the living, they walked among them, causing illness, crop failure, and even death in their wake. It was said that if someone died of a violent or unexplained cause, their soul could become trapped in the body, causing them to return as a revenant, a physical manifestation of death, wandering the earth in search of retribution. The fear of the revenant became so great that the French people took extreme measures to ensure that the dead would not rise. When a person died under suspicious circumstances, their body would often be exhumed, and it would be carefully inspected to ensure that there were no signs of life. If any abnormalities were found, such as blood in the mouth, the corpse being unusually preserved, or signs of movement, the villagers would take immediate action. The body would be subjected to gruesome rituals, including decapitation, staking, or even burning. The aim was always the same: to prevent the dead from walking the earth again. But the revenant myth didn't end with the rituals. It was believed that the dead could come back not just to punish, but to possess the living. Some villagers would guard the graves of their loved ones at night, keeping watch to ensure that no revenant would rise. Others would place heavy objects on the coffins or bury the deceased face down to ensure that the soul could not escape. Even the mourners were not safe, as it was believed that the revenant could attach itself to the living, driving them into madness or sickness. Historians are still divided on the true origins of the revenant belief in France. Some argue that these stories were simply exaggerated accounts of death and disease, while others suggest that the practice was rooted in the fear of premature burial, a common and very real fear during a time when disease could cause people to appear dead, only for them to awaken in their graves. But what remains clear is that for the people of rural France, the revenant was more than a myth. It was a very real, very tangible threat that shaped their lives, their fears, and their understanding of death. The forest opens up into a vast, rolling landscape, the horizon stretching endlessly before you. The sky is a canvas of deep purples and blues, the stars just beginning to twinkle in the vast expanse above. You feel the coolness of the evening on your skin, and as you walk, there's a strange sense of peace as though you've moved beyond time itself. Yet beneath the calm surface, you can still sense that the past is never too far behind, never too far gone to be forgotten. Now we find ourselves in the heart of Greece, at the crossroads of ancient beliefs and modern superstition. By the late 19th century, the country had long been a center of both mythology and philosophical thought. But beneath the great ruins and magnificent temples, there remained an undercurrent of belief that tied the living to the dead in a way that was difficult for even the most enlightened to dismiss. The Greeks, even as they advanced in science and philosophy, retained a deep fear of the spirits of the dead that could rise to walk the earth. The belief in them was particularly strong in the rural villages, where the ties to ancient traditions and the gods of the underworld were still honored. The most terrifying of these beliefs was that the souls of the dead, if not properly appeased, could return as a form of undead spirit that could interact with the living. They were not bloodthirsty vampires, but rather restless spirits whose only desire was to reclaim what was rightfully theirs: peace. However, this peace was often obtained by any means necessary, including the possession of the living or the infliction of illness, insanity, or death. One of the most chilling practices in these villages was the use of psychomancy, a form of divination that sought to contact the dead. It was believed that certain individuals, typically women, had the power to summon the spirits of the dead through special rites, where they would enter a trance-like state to communicate with the departed. But in doing so, they risked awakening something far darker than the peaceful spirits of their ancestors. The once called forth could possess the medium and use their body to communicate with the living. The medium would become a vessel for the dead, their body no longer their own, and they would be forced to carry the burden of the spirit until the proper ritual could be performed to release them. This practice was not widely accepted, as many feared that by calling forth the dead, they were inviting misfortune upon themselves. And yet, some believed that they could provide vital information from the afterlife, such as warnings of impending death, hidden truths, or messages from gods or loved ones who had passed on. But the darker side of psychomancy lay in the stories of those who were said to have become possessed by their bodies used as instruments of the dead's will. Historians still debate whether the practice of psychomancy was a widespread form of necromancy or if it was simply folklore, a way to explain the inexplicable. What remains clear, however, is that the belief in the dead's power over the living was deeply entrenched in Greek culture. For the people of these villages, death was not an end. It was a passage that could lead to something far darker, a continuous cycle of the living interacting with the dead in ways that were not always controllable nor safe. The landscape has shifted, the air now cool and still, with a soft hush enveloping everything around you. You feel a subtle change as though the world is holding its breath, and in the distance you can see the outline of a village, its stone buildings dark against the fading twilight. The moon rises higher, casting its pale light across the land, and you move toward the village, where the next unsettling chapter of this tale awaits, shrouded in both mystery and darkness. We now turn to the early 19th century in the rural corners of the Balkans, where the belief in the and the power of the undead to rise from their graves had woven itself deeply into the culture. This belief in the restless dead was not only tied to the fear of vampires, but also to the fear that the souls of those who died unexpectedly could return to punish the living. The often referred to as the walking dead were said to be able to leave their graves, causing illness, misfortune, and death in their wake. What made the belief in the particularly chilling was not only the fear of the dead returning, but also the specific rituals designed to prevent the dead from rising. It was believed that if a person died under unnatural or violent circumstances, such as suicide, an untimely death, or even due to illness, their soul would be restless, unable to pass peacefully into the afterlife. To prevent the dead from becoming villagers would perform extreme rituals to ensure that the deceased could never return. One of the most disturbing practices was the act of placing a stake through the heart of the deceased. But it wasn't just any stake. It had to be made from a specific type of wood, often ash or hawthorn, which was believed to have the power to trap the spirit inside the body. The corpse would then be decapitated, with the head placed between the legs, and sometimes the body would be burned to ensure that it could never rise again. In some cases, heavy stones were placed on the body, and the grave was sealed to further ensure that the could not escape. But here, where the myth takes a darker turn, in some villages it was believed that they had the power to possess the living. It wasn't just about their return from the grave, but their ability to enter the body of a living person and control them. They were seen as malevolent spirits, driven by anger or unfinished business, and the fear of possession was so great that some villagers would take extreme precautions. They would perform rituals to cleanse the living of any potential influence, and in some cases, entire families would be exhumed and subjected to similar rituals, ensuring that no could rise again. The most unsettling part of this belief was the idea that they could not only rise from the grave, but could also spread their curse to others, infecting the living and creating new in their wake. This created a cycle of fear and superstition, where each death had the potential to lead to further deaths, and the dead were never truly gone. They were simply waiting for the right moment to return. Historians debate the true origins of the legend, with some arguing that it was an explanation for the spread of disease, while others suggest that it was a way to cope with the trauma of unexpected or violent deaths. Whatever the truth may be, the belief in the served as a chilling reminder that death was not a final separation, but a lingering presence that could haunt the living for generations to come. The night is calm now, the storm having passed, and the world around you seems to have fallen into a quiet, almost peaceful stillness. The moon casts a pale, reflective glow on the ground, making everything seem soft, as though the world has been washed clean. You feel a sense of finality, as if this journey is nearing its end, yet the stories still linger, hanging in the air like the last remnants of a dream you can't quite remember. In the heart of 19th century Romania, amidst the dense forests and steep, craggy hills, there was a deep, unsettling belief that the dead could return not only in the form of vampires, but as creatures far more sinister and nocturnes. These creatures, however, were not the graceful, seductive figures of modern vampire lore. They were monstrous beings, reanimated corpses that stalked the night in search of blood, but also of retribution. The idea of in this area was terrifying not just because they could rise from the grave, but because they were tied to the family and the land itself. It was believed that if a member of the family died prematurely or under questionable circumstances, that person's soul might refuse to leave, turning into a. But these weren't just restless spirits, they were filled with rage, driven by the anger of not being allowed to complete their lives. They didn't just seek blood, they sought vengeance. What made them particularly terrifying was their ability to control the living, and it was believed that they could turn others into vampires as well, creating a cycle of undead that would spread like a plague through the family. Once someone was bitten by they would become one themselves, and the cycle of death would continue. These beings were said to have the ability to shape-shift, appearing as animals, most commonly as wolves, but also as mists or shadows, entities that could pass through walls and enter homes at will. This power came not just from their thirst for blood, but from their ability to control the living, to possess them, to bind them to their will. In some villages, it was believed that these creatures could take control of the body and soul of the living and use them for their own purposes. Entire families would be haunted by the return of these creatures, their bodies stolen, their lives taken piece by piece. The only way to stop them was to drive a stake through its heart, but even this was not always enough. There was said to be a creature that could not be truly destroyed, only temporarily stopped, until the next time it rose. The most chilling part of this belief was the notion that the dead were not simply lying in their graves, resting in peace. They were waiting for an opportunity to strike, to reclaim their place among the living, and to turn the living into their own vessels. They were the embodiment of fear itself, the fear that death was not an end but a cycle, one that would continue to haunt the living for as long as they refused to accept the finality of death. Historians still question whether the legends were born from fear of disease and death, or if they were a way for the villagers to understand the sudden and violent deaths that occurred during that time. But what is clear is that for the people of Romania, the fear of the was not simply a myth. It was a reality they lived with, passed down from generation to generation, as an ever-present reminder that death never fully lets go. The night has quieted completely now, the air still and thick with a heavy, almost suffocating silence. The forest around you feels like a distant memory, as though you have crossed into a world where time has stopped. The moonlight is now a faint, silvery glow, softening the edges of the world as if the earth itself is sighing in relief. The journey you've undertaken through the dark history of the dead and the living has finally come to an end. And yet something still lingers, a quiet unease, as though the past is never truly gone, merely waiting to resurface when least expected. In this final chapter, we reflect on the journey we've taken together, through the ancient and eerie world of death's lingering presence. From the of Scandinavia to the of Romania, from the of the islands to the revenants of France, we have traveled far and deep, uncovering the mysteries and fears that once governed the lives of those who believed that death was never truly final. For the people of these distant lands, death was not just an event, it was a force. It was something that could be manipulated, controlled, and sometimes even thwarted. The dead were not simply buried and forgotten, they were watched, guarded, and feared. The belief in the revenant and countless other creatures of the night reveals a deep, primal fear that has haunted humanity for centuries. The fear that the dead do not truly rest. But as we close this chapter, we are reminded that these ancient fears were more than just superstition. They were the result of real, visceral experiences, plagues, wars, untimely deaths, and unexplained phenomena that shattered the sense of control the living once had. In a world where disease could strike without warning, where death came suddenly and violently, it was only natural that people would turn to the supernatural for explanations and protection. The undead, the revenants, and the spirits that haunted the living were ways of grappling with a world that often seemed beyond understanding or control. And so the cycle of life and death continued. The dead remain tied to the living, not as peaceful spirits, but as forces to be reckoned with, each one holding a piece of the mystery that humanity has yet to fully comprehend. Even as time moved on, as modernity slowly replaced superstition, these stories continued to linger, shaping folklore, literature, and even our own fears of the unknown. But now, as the night finally begins to fade into dawn, we come to the end of our journey. The world around you slowly returns to the quiet, peaceful hum of the present, as the last remnants of the ancient stories slip away into the shadows once again. There's no need for fear now, no need for the watchful eyes of the living to guard against the dead. The dead are where they belong, beneath the earth, resting in peace. So as you take a final breath of the cool, fresh air, you feel a sense of calm wash over you. The story is over. The night is ending. And for now, the living remain in control. The dead are just that, dead, and they can no longer rise. And with that, let's allow the whispers of history to fade as we move into the light of a new day.